So welcome everyone. I really appreciate you joining us for our newest episode in the Discover Tennessee History webinar series. This collaborative has been working together now for 2 years, trying to think about how we can share some of the great resources from the various organizations across the state. So today's presentation is from Tennessee State Parks, and Hobart Aiken is going to be talking with us about some of the New Deal resources that the state parks has. Before I turn things over to him, though, I want to take just a second to remind you guys of a few things. One, we are recording these sessions to share on our Facebook page. Or not on Facebook, I'm sorry, on our YouTube channel. You can actually find all of the different webinars that we have done in this series on the Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU YouTube channel. They're all in one list. So you can just look for the Discover Tennessee History series to find all of those. So if you would, please make sure that you keep your mics muted throughout, and that just helps us to have a cleaner audio on the recording. Also, if you would find your name in the participant list and make sure it's showing your first and last name, and that just helps us to know who we're talking to in the chat box. And then also remember that we do want these sessions to be interactive. So again, go ahead and open up that chat box. Feel free to share with us your name and where you're joining us from. And as we go through, if you have questions or comments or think of resources, again, feel free to kind of put that in there. We do want to be able to interact with everyone. You also have the option of using reaction buttons, and you should be able to find those at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I think that Zoom has actually added a few new ones, so those are fun. And again, feel free to make use of those as we go through. We also have a Padlet for this series, and so you can find that there at this link or using this QR code. And the Padlet is a great place to go to find links to all of the resources for this session that Hobart's going to be sharing with us, but then also for all of the resources from the previous sessions that we have done since September. So again, that's all in kind of there in that one place. So again, we'll share that again at the end of the session, but again, that's something just keep in mind that we do have available. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to our presenter, Hobart Aiken, for today's session. Thank you, Hobart.
Hey, no problem. All right, let me do this. All right, so yeah, I'm pretty excited to talk to you all today about kind of the New Deal resources that we have inside Tennessee State Parks. Tennessee State Parks is a is kind of really a product of the New Deal. The creation of the Department of Conservation happened in 1937, in which the state assembled 16 parks that had been constructed by New Deal programs, everything from the TVA, the National Park Service's Recreation Development Program, as well as partnerships with the U.S. Forest Service, recreation areas across the state. So Tennessee State Parks, in a lot of ways, itself as a system is kind of a monument to the New Deal in a lot of ways. And so it's kind of a great place to learn a lot about the New Deal program. Specifically, one of the ones that we talk a lot about is the Civilian Conservation Corps. Although, we had a lot of work done too by other New Deal organizations like the WPA. TVA is also incredibly important in the history of Tennessee State Parks. Real quick too, I wanted to tell you guys about some of the resources that were on the Padlet there. I listed contact information for, I think it's 13 parks that offer interpretive programming on the Civilian Conservation Corps or the kind of the New Deal elements of their park. We are currently right now trying to get an education page put up on the Tennessee State Parks website. We don't have any online resources yet, but within the next, I think, 6 months to a year, we're going to have a massive website redo that should have some educator guides placed there yet. I would include a URL to that, but I don't have what that will be yet. So just kind of stay tuned to the State Parks page. Be an education tab kind of appearing there shortly. So for right now, we're still kind of a brick and mortar operation. So we're not quite in the 21st century yet, but our folks love to kind of the CCC and the New Deal. So the New Deal is like it's a really cool story. It's a story in Tennessee of kind of how Tennessee kind of changes from a pretty rural and economically depressed state, especially at the beginning of the Great Depression, but really even kind of in the 1920s, the state has a reputation for being a very rural area, kind of a violent state as well, too. And I've always thought that this image from Wilder, Tennessee kind of encapsulated that in a lot of ways. This was an image that TVA used a lot in their publications to talk about Tennessee and kind of its natural resources. The town was the site of coal mining strikes. And so it kind of had kind of every kind of negative stereotype that you could think of about the state. But it's interesting that at the beginning of the New Deal, the state starts off with this reputation, but by 1947, it's also the site of Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is, a nuclear research facility. It's a top-notch place for science. So the New Deal is kind of really the story from Wilder to Oak Ridge. In Tennessee, the New Deal, especially in Tennessee State Parks, the New Deal is about two types of kind of conservation of natural resources, but also conservation of the citizens. And this sign here from Bledsoe State Forest, which is just outside of Fall Creek Falls, really kind of encapsulates that the best. I've always thought this is great, is the conserving natural resources and making better citizens. And, several of these New Deal programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the work done by the WPA, those kinds of things, but especially the Civilian Conservation Corps, were very kind of at the heart of that, like kind of the philosophy of that, is bringing these young men, really kids, into the forest to teach them to be, young men, young productive members of society. But the resources of Tennessee before the New Deal that you really kind of about when you think about the story of Tennessee State Parks and kind of the New Deal, the federal programs. Erosion and forestry in the state had been a long-term problem. I've read reports from the state geologists going way back actually into the 19th century, talking about erosion and erosion of farmland as a major concern of the state. This is a picture from 1901 in East Tennessee, kind of somewhere near the Smoky Mountains. The caption didn't spell it out a whole lot, but it could be taken in a lot of places in the state. As a matter of fact, we have one from the Department of Conservation photograph collection that was taken near Chickasaw State Park in West Tennessee that shows erosion as well. And this has been a problem for quite some time. And the problem with erosion in the state of Tennessee is that throughout much of the state, we have soil that's not particularly great, especially in parts of West Tennessee. You have pretty thin topsoil. And then underneath that is a wind-blown sediment called loess, which just kind of, anytime you kind of strip away that topsoil, it runs with the next rain or it blows away in a wind event. So if you are setting up your farm fields in a way to where you're not really kind of aware of these forces, you can wind up with some pretty serious erosion issues. And throughout the state, it had been a major problem for quite some time. One of the big culprits of this was logging and forestry. Throughout the end of the 19th century, logging in the state had taken off in a big way. And most people are aware of the stuff that happened in East Tennessee where we have the national forest, but it was also a problem or not a problem, it was also a big industry in, this is from Big South Fork near Pickett State Park. There was also a lot of logging that went on out that way as well in the Cumberland Plateau. But even West Tennessee had a pretty robust logging industry as well too. So logging and timber operations across the state that affect a lot of the natural resources. And when you clear a lot of trees off of land, you not only wind up with issues around erosion, but that soil all kind of has to go somewhere. So the state was facing another kind of natural resource issue in silting in of streams, which would cause kind of all sorts of other natural resource problems. From increased flooding was a problem. When you dump a lot of soil and sediment into a stream, you naturally raise the a lot more problematic for flooding. So it's one of those things where you can cause some real cascading effects from this. It was so bad, in fact, that in 1919, and this is an important geological report actually too for Tennessee State Parks. I don't know if I have the quote in here, but if not, I'll share it at the end. But anyways, this is a great quote on kind of the status of the forest of Tennessee in 1919. This is coming right out of World War I. So this is right after World War I. And the state geologist Wilbur Nelson wrote, "Our forests are making their last stand against the unscientific lumbermen, and the conditions of our woodlands is a source of regret to all." And so the natural resources of Tennessee, even 10 years, before the Great Depression, we're in some real problems. There's terms like wastelands, and some other really kind of drastic language thrown in there. Robert Wright, the first state historian, actually even wrote in a textbook that talked about engullied areas scattered across the state, which were kind of a problem with this too. And you add into that the Great Depression. So once the Great Depression, kind of comes in there's an economic problem. You've got natural that are kind of, they're in some pretty dire straits in some parts of the state. Just reading the state records that are out there, just stuff from the state geology. But then you add in the economic problems from and you've got kind of really this pretty bad storm. You've got the stock market crash, which we're actually approaching I do like to remind folks in our division that we are approaching kind of the 100-year anniversary of that. It's not that far off. And then the 1931 collapse of the Caldwell and Company brokerage firm, which was ran a collection of banks. When that happens, it actually winds up taking most of the state's money with it as well. Most folks haven't heard of the $7 million that the state lost in the collapse of the Caldwell Company. And and all of this then kind of feeds into the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promises a New Deal for Americans. And a big part for Tennessee is kind of this rebuilding of Tennessee. And this is a great quote from when he signed the TVA Act in 1933, which is like right off the heels of his election. But it really kind of talks a lot about kind of the importance to Tennessee and kind of what Tennessee gets from the New Deal. Really in a lot of ways, New Deal programs rebuilt a lot of Tennessee, and state parks are a great place to kind of see a lot of this kind of like rebuilding natural resources and rebuilding great citizens, kind of play out. And so, really, state parks, when we go to talking about this, one of the answers to this issue with rebuilding Tennessee as far as a workforce thing is the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the Civilian Conservation Corps is also one of these really early created entities by FDR. It's initially called the Emergency Conservation Work Program. But it is one of these things that, so in addition to seeing all of these like grown men lose their jobs, there's a real concern in DC about watching all of these young men kind of listlessly wander the streets of America, kind of looking for something to do. And as most of us have been around, like 18 to 19-year-old guys with nothing to do, it can be kind of a recipe for disaster. So one of the real kind of pushes from the administration is to find something for these guys to do, and to find something to do to turn them into good and upstanding citizens. And the CCC is one of them. So Roosevelt has a great quote here too, talking about how the CCC is going to work to turn these guys into strong, renegade, and ready for re-entrance into industry. So it's a program where they really feel like they're going to be rebuilding resources, but also building kind of the workforce that goes with that. And so the idea, these guys into the woods, where they would into the woods and streams of, not in the streams, but into the woods and fields of Tennessee, kind of in the wild areas, and they would learn the basics of a hard day's work. They could kind of learn some real skills while they were out there, but also just kind of learn that value of putting in a hard day's work. And the CCC, they learned a lot of skills. This is a construction project actually at Big Ridge. I think I saw somebody in the chat said they were from Maynardville, so this isn't far from y'all, but this is a dam that was constructed at Big Ridge. There's actually a couple other pictures from Big Ridge as well too. So the guys would learn about construction and construction trades. They would learn a lot about forestry as well too. Erosion and erosion control, especially through tree planting, was a big part of the CCC. As a matter of fact, you can still drive around several places in the state and see trees that were planted by the CCC. And it's kind of funny, or I think it's funny, because back in the 30s, they didn't necessarily plant native trees like today in parks. And one of the big management things we do in most of our parks is we're really focused on planting native species to the state. So that are here naturally. But back in the 30s, that wasn't as big a deal. You go up to Pickett State Park, where they planted a lot of trees in the forest, and there's Norway spruce up there. Well, we don't have Norway spruce naturally occurring like anywhere in Tennessee. It's kind of funny because when you walk through the forest, it's pretty obvious because it looks like Christmas trees off to the side. But we still have a lot of these things kind of as like a living monument to the efforts of the CCC. But forestry was one of the key components, one of the key things that guys learned while they were working in the Corps. And so it was composed mostly of young guys. It's the largest peacetime mobilization that the United States has ever had. Mobilized 3 million men over 9 years, and approximately like a little over 750,000, or almost about 1/3 of a million, sorry, in the first 3 months. And like I said, they worked on a variety of conservation projects. I mean, the erosion control, reforestation, water resource development. Again, thinking about all the damage that had been done by kind of logging and resource extraction over the course of several decades. They did a lot to really kind of control runoff of fields, runoff of mountains. Road construction inside these forests and inside these kind of natural resource projects. So one of the things you need to think about too is fire is a big problem during this time period. So getting fire crews where you need to get fire crews is a pretty important infrastructure project to maintaining forests at this time. And also just kind of general infrastructure development. They also ran telephone wires and things like that in some of their projects. And finally, the one that I am the most fond of is our collection of parks. And so the CCC, it really was a response to two like big problems facing the country, like one human, one natural. And I love this quote from Liniger about that. So again, these concerns over like a listless, unemployed generation are really kind of like through a lot of this, and it shows up a lot in the way they organize the CCC. It also has a lot to do with kind of these like progressive ideas of like efficiency. So having an efficient workforce was also had a lot to do with kind of this training here too. So they were training guys like efficient workers as well. We talked a little bit about fires. So, in order to make sure that these forests kind of stick around and are efficiently used, fire prevention methods and education about fire prevention was a big part of the CCC as well too. So, as I mentioned earlier, it started as the Emergency Conservation Work Program, and it was initially renewed for 2 years, and it became the CCC after a speech that Roosevelt gave. And that name kind of stuck. And originally it consisted of guys 18 to 25, military age guys. However, later on they opened it up to World War I vets, and you'll see these veteran companies show up in the rosters from time to time. I'm trying to think of where they were in Tennessee, and my mind is blanking. For some reason, I know where they were in Texas better than I do than they were in Tennessee. But we did have World War I vets who were working around. And like I said, by July of that year, there were 275,000 guys enrolled. The first crews were here almost after everything started in 34. And really the program lasted for quite some time at a pretty high level until cutbacks in 37 really kind of reduced the size. And the program ended once World War II really picked up steam. A lot of these young guys who were being utilized on these conservation projects, so the national defense felt like they needed more. And here's some stats on infrastructure development. It's one of those things where you don't really kind of appreciate how much stuff happened like nationally and how many things got nationally. But honestly, not only Tennessee state parks, but pretty much every state park system in the country benefited from the CCC in ways that would be very difficult for the state park systems to kind of imagine of doing kind of on their own. Like I said, Tennessee owes 16 of its core parks to the efforts of the CCC of the New Deal, and many other parks can say a lot of the same things in a lot of park systems. CCC crews, WPA crews, laid a lot of the groundwork for providing access for an entire generation to outdoor recreation, which had kind of cascading consequences, as we'll talk about here in a second. Oh, wrong button. So specifically in Tennessee, these guys built 98 lookout houses. They laid almost 4,000 miles of telephone lines. They built over 1,000 miles of roads. And they just did, you could see just how much work these guys did. I mean, they spent 134,811 man-hour days fighting fires. They were really, they did a lot in the state. And there were roughly 70,000 Tennessee men who served in the CCC. And you'll see a list of parks down there underneath them where they constructed a lot of the early infrastructure that is at the park. Now, this image that's here is taken at Cumberland Mountain State Park. If you guys haven't been to Cumberland Mountain State Park, it's totally worth going to. But that dam there is the largest masonry dam that the CCC ever constructed. And it is, we still talk about it kind of like all the time, but this is a pretty, matter of fact, if you Google the CCC in Tennessee, this is one of the most famous images that shows up of these CCC guys working on the Birds Creek Reservoir that's at the park. And again, like I said, tree planting and soil conservation were a big part of that as well too. You can still see a lot of these trees around today, and they really did do a great job preserving a lot of these landscapes that are out there. And it's interesting too, kind of the legacy of a lot of this stuff. This is from Our Land, Our Living, which was a textbook written for teachers in conservation education by one of the gentlemen down there. Jim Bailey was the first educator to work for Tennessee State Parks. He worked in the education division, and his whole job was to go around the state hosting teacher workshops, almost kind of like we're doing now. And he would teach about conservation initiatives. So he would talk a lot about soil erosion control, fire prevention, those kinds of things. And then the teachers would pass that along to their students. Another interesting fact is Jim Bailey worked for the WPA and the writers program. So he likely wrote some elements of the WPA guide for Tennessee, dealing with kind of the natural resources of Tennessee. But in addition to the forestry roads, they built a lot of infrastructure in parks. This is one of the bridges inside Pickett State Forest that was built by the CCC. These bridges really did kind of open up a lot of access to these places. If you look at a highway map from this era, you'll notice that there's a lot of highways that were used to existing that did not exist at this time. So these roads into some of these areas are some of the first real kind of well-established roads into some of these areas. Beforehand, you would have roads that had been used as logging roads, but these were actually some really, really good roads. And there's another shot actually right here. This is the, now this is kind of a little bit misleading because this road was really built by the WPA, but it was built at Standing Stone State Park. And these roads really allowed people to visit parks. One of the big ideas behind state parks and state park creation was making a weekend getaway to a campground accessible to most Americans. Kind of the thinking behind this was, cities and factory jobs where people work are, they're really trying on people. They're hard, it's hard work. And it's one of those things where it really grinds folks down. If you're working in your factory job all day, all out, and one of the things that would make you a better, more efficient worker would be as if you could hop in the family automobile, drive 50 miles to a nearby park and spend the weekend in a natural setting. You could come back as a more refreshed worker, a more efficient, kind of all those progressive era ideals that we have out there. And so, these roads inside parks are pretty important from the user standpoint, as well as, kind of from the philosophical standpoint of having, of rebuilding Tennessee's both like its workforce and its natural resources. New Deal projects worked on state highways too. They had state highways leading up to parks. This one actually leads to Pikeville, 30. But they also built, like I said, the buildings inside most of our state parks. As a matter of fact, in the list of parks that I gave you, most of them have something that's still standing from the Civilian Conservation Corps era. Some of them do not. Some of them just have the camp that's left. But a lot of this really iconic architecture was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in Tennessee State Parks. And these are buildings that are still like treasured by our system. They're things that, honestly, we would not, I don't know that we would have, they're built so well, I don't know that we would be able to rebuild them now with our state budget. But they're really scenic places. They're well-designed, well-sited in parks. And they really kind of set an identity for parks that lasted for a long time. You can look at one of these buildings and know that it is a park building just from looking at it. And we owe a lot of that to the work of the CCC as well as the WPA. So the organization of the Corps is also something that's really good to kind of talk about, because it's something that most folks haven't really considered. So the companies lived in camps administered by the War Department, with Army Reserve officers running the camps. Each company that lived at the camps consisted of about 200 men. And they followed military schedules. They had scheduled meals, work assignments. They lived in barracks. The projects themselves, sorry, not the park projects, but the projects themselves were administered by other federal agencies. So occasionally that's TVA, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, these guys then would go on these work projects and work usually with these local experienced men, or LEMs, as you see them referred to from time to time. And this is all very, very important, because this is a very, very military organization. The roughly 200 enrollees, this is what an infantry company would look like organizationally, which is pretty interesting. But part of the military routine is doing things like, this is a retreat at the Turkey Creek camp. And so, going through these military services and drill, like ceremonies and drill, were a big part of being in the camp. Now, it's interesting too, I should note, despite the kind of military structure to everything, the CCC was very adamant that it was not a military training program when it was ongoing. It was just the military was the only organization in the United States government that knew how to deal with 18 to 25-year-old young men who were away from home for the first time. So it was really kind of one of those things that the military just kind of ran it, and the military ran things the way they knew it. They knew to run things. The other interesting thing to talk about is these reserve officers who are running the Civilian Conservation Corps camps. Initially, these guys did not want this duty. A lot of these guys joined the military to do other things, and sitting out in the woods and administering a camp with a bunch of guys who were out cutting trees or planting trees or doing kind of service projects all day was not really their ideal of like a top-notch assignment. However, and the War Department initially resisted like giving a lot of commitment to this. However, the War Department realized, there's a lot of experience that military officers could garner from this kind of exercise. So they actually wound up using the CCC camps as almost a training program for their own officers by the end of the program, just because it was a really good like peacetime exercise. Running a camp of 200 men and making sure they're fed, clothed, and well taken care of is an administrative task. And most of the job of a junior officer in the military revolves around doing these administrative tasks. So this is something that the Army finally kind of realized that this is a great training opportunity for things. So they would use this because it helped the officers develop a lot of the administrative skills they would need to be successful military officers, but also taught guys a lot about leadership and kind of some of the soft skills that go along with leadership to be successful military officers. And the military was able to use this a couple of times. There's some pretty serious flooding episodes in across Middle and West Tennessee in 1937 that this military structure allowed guys to be mobilized and utilized for. So the CCC was actually, it worked out to be a pretty good deal for the War Department. The War Department was able to use it pretty well, and actually we'll talk even more about that here in a minute. And again, like I said, these military ceremonies were like a real big part of this. Now, one thing is cool. This is in Pikeville, Tennessee, which is out near Fall Creek Falls. But the other thing I did want to point out in this too is, I always assume that there's like loads more trees in the past, but if you look in the background of this picture, you will see not many trees. Again, so this military component of this was really important. It also taught the guys who were in the camps how to work in a military system. So the enrollees themselves learned what it was like to be in a unit. So they would, work in the camp. There would be work in the camp PXs, but they'd also get used to using an institution like a PX. And if you've ever been on a military base, a PX is a big, is a part of the military base. So for enrollees, this also taught them kind of a lot about, military themselves too, which would be important in a few years. One other aspect of life in the Civilian Conservation Corps was segregation in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, initially, the Corps was not necessarily planned as a segregated organization, but the Robert Fechner, who ran the organization, was a serious segregationist. He was from Chattanooga originally, and then wound up working on the for a Georgia rail company. But he instituted segregation across the system, and it became just kind of part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. In Tennessee state parks, we have several parks that had exclusively African-American CCC companies. One in particular is Montgomery Bell State Park, which is in Dixon County. The interesting thing about that site is the park was developed by an African-American CCC company, but when the park opened, it was not open to African Americans. It was opened as a segregated park. So in several instances, these African American Civilian Conservation Corps crews would build parks that they themselves would not be able to use. Other parks that were built by these guys, they did the work at Booker T. Washington State Park, at T.O. Fuller State Park. There was even African American CCC crews at Meeman Shelby for a while. So they did a lot of work in a lot of places across the state. The other kind of legacy of the CCC too is the CCC really had a big impact on the conservation movement. So when you had all these guys at the camps, they weren't only just doing these work projects. A lot of them were attending school that was being taught by real kind of professionals in forestry, biology taught courses, and so a lot of these young men who went into the CCC, who may not have even known how to read or write at the time they came in, learned not only kind of some of the basic skills, like some of the basic education skills in it, but they also learned a lot about the sciences. And this really worked to create a generation with a real conservation ethos. As a matter of fact, if you look at kind of the who's who of conservationists in the 20th century, a lot of them at some point had some kind of interaction with the Civilian Conservation Corps, either working with them or being an enrollee themselves. And so, a lot of these guys who were in these corps developed would serve them later. The 1950s is known as kind of the great outdoor recreation boom, which is when a lot of these guys, if they went on to World War II, would come back or be starting their own families. So it's something where it really did create a whole generation of people who were interested in being kind of conservationists themselves. But some of the real big names in conservation that were affected by the CCC were folks like Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold worked with the CCC in Wisconsin at a place called Coon Valley. And it's interesting, like he was really impressed with kind of the work that went on, but he reacted pretty strongly to just kind of the single-minded focus of some of the CCC projects. He felt like a lot of the times there was a lot of like emphasis on like doing things and not necessarily thinking about why you're doing things. That was echoed by a guy, George Melendez Wright, who actually, there's a journal now that studies the history of the Park Service. It's still fairly active, but it's called the George Wright Society, and they produced the George Wright Forum. George Wright was the assistant naturalist at Yosemite. He proposed a wildlife program and is responsible for the ending of like killing predators on parks. And he worked a lot with the CCC as well, too. And he was also kind of critical of the Corps' focus on removing combustible materials from forest floors, kind of its approach to it's kind of I guess a really attentive nature to forest fire control and removing forest materials. And so he was a biologist who really is really trying to push people to think more about kind of how these whole ecosystems work together. And a lot of that came from his experience working with the Corps. One of my favorites is Bob Marshall. Bob Marshall and the Wilderness Society is another kind of group of conservationists that interacted with the Civilian Conservation Corps. He worked with them in the Smoky Mountain National Park. And Bob Marshall, this is as a side, this is one of my favorite wilderness areas in the country that he's at. He's at the area that would become the Boundary Waters canoe area, Boundary Waters canoe area in upper Minnesota. But he would kind of react against all of these roads and these developments in these parks because Bob wanted to be somewhere where it was wild, where he wouldn't have to hear a car, where he could be somewhere where he was really out in the middle of things. So into building all of these things, the conservation things that the CCC did really moved the ball forward. The sciences, it really provoked a lot of scientists to think about, kind of the impacts and the implications of doing a lot of these projects. And it really, it had a big impact in kind of how we approach and talk about these problems. So, other New Deal programs that impacted Tennessee state parks that we talk about in state parks are, so there's the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. They did a lot of similar work to the CCC. As a matter of fact, several of our parks, Cedar's, Lebanon, had a lot of work done by the WPA. Standing Stone State Park out near Livingston had a lot of work done by the WPA. Matter of fact, I think the next picture is from Standing Stone. They worked in parks. They worked on roads, buildings, civic infrastructure. They were hired from folks from the local community. So rather than the CCC, since it was organized along military lines, guys are issued uniforms. They're in companies and that. WPA workers tended to show up in the work clothes that they had, it was really designed to lessen the effects of unemployment in the state and to accomplish meaningful projects. It also kind of had the unintended consequences of raising wages here in the South too. So it was one of those things where the WPA paid, not great, but paid well enough to where they kind of helped impact wages down here in the South. The other one that's really important for Tennessee, and it's funny because I get in trouble all the time. I'll be talking to somebody from another state and I'll drop TVA and they'll be like, who? I'll be like, oh yeah, I forget, because I'm in Tennessee that people don't eat, breathe, sleep TVA all the time. But TVA is also an incredibly important organization for Tennessee state parks. As a matter of fact, as far as the New Deal programs that had really like the most lasting impact on the management and the approach of like how Tennessee state parks thought of itself, TVA is right up there. The majority of the parks that Tennessee acquired from the New Deal were TVA projects, and so a lot of kind of their ideas about outdoor recreation and recreation development we kind of inherited as a system later on. But TVA also, if you go into a room and talk about TVA anywhere in the state, you will get a whole host of reactions because it's one of those organizations where they seized a lot of land by eminent domain. They moved a lot of people off their land. So it's one of those things where they're kind of a controversial organization depending upon kind of where you're at in the state. But they really did. They reshaped the Tennessee Valley in ways that are very striking even to this day. And then these infrastructure projects that they did really did power wartime Tennessee once World War II broke out. Most of the rural electrification projects, the development of all these power stations really brought power to areas of Tennessee that hadn't really had power yet. You had power in cities, but some of these rural areas did not have power. And then there's the Public Works Authority. That's another organization out there. I don't think we had a PWA project on parks. I could be wrong, but I don't recall one right off the top of my head. But yeah, here's the guys from the WPA. Again, it's kind of sad and unfortunate sometimes because the WPA did a lot of work in Tennessee state parks as well too. Talk most often about the CCC guys, but they this is a project that began in 1935, ended in 1943. Although by the time World War II starts off, we don't really have as many park projects. Most of the projects are geared towards the defense industry. So most of the WPA projects wrapped up, I believe, by 42 in Tennessee state parks. But they did a lot of work in a lot of. I'm willing to bet y'all can drive past WPA stuff in towns in cities across the state, post offices, schools, things like that. The most striking WPA piece of architecture we have in Tennessee state parks is the Cedar Forest Lodge, which is pretty close to Murfreesboro here. It's near Lebanon. It's close to Lebanon. It's in Wilson County, but this piece of architecture here is still used today a lot by Tennessee state parks. It's I'll be remiss if I don't. It's one of our most popular wedding venues, if you're curious. So people do get married there pretty regularly. But it is a real testament to kind of the accomplishments of the WPA. But the WPA, I always like to mention, they built a lot of post offices. There's a lot of WP post offices across the country. There's also a fair number of schools too. This one is the Shady Valley School, which is in Johnson County, still standing. I think it's actually still being used. So it's another one, but we talk about too. So, inside Tennessee state parks, we talk about kind of all these programs as well too. And then kind of the other, like I mentioned before, the big elephant in the room is the Tennessee Valley Authority. And for us, the park that really has been, we talk about it at Cove Lake, Big Ridge, talk about TVA, but Norris Dam, Norris Dam State Park is like the TVA park. It is literally, the park is cut in half by the dam. So the dam sits in the center of it. And so we talk a lot about TVA at places like Norris Dam. But finally, the one thing I did want to talk about, because this is something that I like to bring up with our interpreters inside TSP, is kind of the ties between World War II and the New Deal. I remember, a lot of times we kind of struggle to interpret the New Deal because it's one of those historic events that the public doesn't seem to be as aware of, and it's not something that they have a huge base knowledge to work off of. But most people know about World War II, and I've been really encouraging our interpreters to make connections between World War II and the New Deal, because as Pamela Tyler said, the more you look at it, the more difficult it is to separate the impact, the effects of the New Deal and World War II, especially here in the South. So, we've talked a lot about infrastructure improvements. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which opened our presentation, was powered by electricity from a TVA project, powered from Norris Dam, powered the atomic research that happened there. A lot of these factories and infrastructure were powered by things that were paid for by the New Deal. You have better roads, which allowed to move goods around during wartime. It allowed repositioning of troops during training exercises across the mid-state. The infrastructure improvements were real in Tennessee. If you look at highway maps before and after the New Deal, it's a big deal. There's a lot of stuff that happened in these years. But the other thing is the manpower element. Up to 80% of the Civilian Conservation Corps enrollees became non-commissioned officers during the Second World War. And I talked a little bit earlier about the experience of the enrollees learning how to be young men. And it's kind of interesting if you read some of the oral histories that have been done with guys who went to the military afterwards, they'll credit the CCC with kind of a lot of turning them into young men and young leaders because they learned a lot about themselves kind of working out in these woods. But also, if anybody's been in the military or knows somebody who's been in the military, the military does things a very particular kind of way. And I know from doing a lot of research on how Tennessee prepared for World War I and kind of how we sent the doughboys off, that a lot of the doughboys had no idea what it was like to be in the military before they went off. And they may have gotten at the most a 12-week kind of introduction before they're put on a boat and sent to France. In Tennessee, the CCC did a lot to kind of train these young men to be ready for entry into World War II. It's one of those things where there's by being in these military companies, learning how to order stuff, how to find stuff, where to find stuff, and work in that kind of organization taught them a lot. It also taught those reserve officers how to lead people in World War II. It taught a lot of kind of military skills kind of through connections. So there's some pretty serious connections between World War II and the development of the American military that went into World War II and the guys from the CCC. So in a lot of ways, and I'll end with this, a lot of ways, there's a lot more connections between the woods of East Tennessee, West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and the CCC projects that happened, and then things like this iconic image here, which is iconic image from World War II, which is the landings at Normandy Beach, on beaches Normandy. Now, I'd like to end with that just so that you guys kind of understand that all of these New Deal efforts, things that built parks and did that, they also built a generation of young Americans who we still talk about a lot today. In a lot of ways, we still kind of idolize. So, in Tennessee State Parks, we talk a lot about the legacy of the Civilian Conservation Corps and the New Deal. And so this is something that we really kind of spend a lot of time on. And I think the state parks are one of the greatest places to kind of learn about the New Deal, because in many ways, they're still monuments to this generation of folks. And with that, I'm not new share. I'm going to end there we go. My share. All right.
So Harper, we had a couple questions. One, someone asked, was TVA responsible for making the land between the lakes in Western Kentucky?
Yes. Yeah, that was LBL is a later project, but it is a TVA project. And I think it was I know it really picks up steam by the 50s. So when we build Paris Landing State Park in the 50s, a lot of the ideas behind building Paris Landing in West Tennessee, where it was to take advantage of the perceived traffic influx that was going to come into that part of the state from the development of LBL. And so you see that in the justification for building the big Paris Landing Inn that was there at the time, which is one of the first 2 inns that Tennessee State Parks builds.
And I had a question. You mentioned, forest, fire prevention and fire issues pretty frequently. So was that more of an issue during that period of time? Because I don't really think about it being much of an issue.
Yeah, forest fires back, I think the worst year for state forest fires, and I could be wrong, I think it was like it was in the 50s or the early 50s or something like that as far as number of acres burned, but it was a pretty big problem throughout the state. If you read the state forester reports, forest fire occupies a lot of their time. And like even in the educational efforts, I love this, there's a lot of educational efforts out there talking about, the waste of a forest fire. Burning these valuable croplands and stuff like that. But it was a pretty big deal and a pretty big challenge and undertaking during the time. If you read, like I said, those forester reports are pretty stark and dire in some instances about forest fire and forest fire prevention. Matter of fact, even during some of our early operations manuals, like one of the few things that we really have a process and policy spelled out for was forest fires. Like how do we respond to forest fires? It was a much bigger concern than it is today.
So James asked how much of forest fires were against lumber companies. So I guess the lumber companies, like how were they contributing?
So the lumber companies. Are you talking about like maybe like an arson against lumber companies? Or are you talking about, okay, I see nodding. So I'm assuming, yeah. So I'm sure there was some arson of lumber companies. I know when you read things like there's several publications like the Southern Lumberman, and they are very concerned about arsonists in the forests at the time. And they talk a lot about like, arsonists and crazy loggers who are out there, like burning stuff down to stick it to the man or something like that. I'm struggling to think not, because really and truly the practices that they had for forestry back then weren't like great. So a lot of that may have also just been kind of an attempt to kind of deflect their own kind of poor land management practices onto their workforce, if that makes sense. And as far as fires today in state parks are usually caused by a whole, and even back during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, were caused usually through a kind of a variety of things, usually just kind of a thoughtless, careless accident, or sometimes they're intentional as well too. I'm struggling to think of a particular instance where we got a definitive arson in the like 1920s, but I know I've seen, if you read the Southern Lumberman, that trade journal, they talk about it a lot.
All right, do we have any other questions?
I think I see, so promotional material listing.
Good way of asking, is there anywhere that someone could go to see specifically like which parks in Tennessee were built by New Deal programs? Because I know we have the history company here out of Cleveland that does some CCC related stuff with Point Park.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, like Booker T. Washington, Harrison Bay, none of those really have materials that like my students could find if they were doing a web search on the New Deal in Tennessee.
Yeah, and this is something we're still kind of desperately behind the times. I'm going to apologize, but yeah, we don't have anything up on the web just yet. The park staff there are usually pretty good about that, but yeah, we are working over the next year or so to develop educator guides and resources that we can upload to the website, but we're just not there yet.
Well, so long as it's coming down the pipeline, that's hopeful.
Yes, yeah, we had our staff meeting we have a weekly staff meeting. We had it this morning, and we talked about getting the education tab up here soon. And so hopefully within the next year or so, we'll be able to start putting stuff on that. See virtual. Oh, there's several of them. Yeah, and then someone mentioned the Living New Deal site. That is an awesome website. If you've not checked out the Living New Deal, there is a lot of information there that's already been kind of crowdsourced from a variety of places, and it can show you a lot of cool stuff, especially like post offices, courthouses, things like that, your students are probably like well aware of. It's downtown or something like that. I use that website with our rangers pretty regularly. Notable architecture projects. So Pickett State Park up in Jamestown, Tennessee has some really iconic and pretty early park buildings in it. Let me see, there's of course the stuff at Standing Stone, Cedars, Lebanon. Meeman Shelby has a group camp that's really striking as well that we were doing a restoration project on, which I'd actually like to get an update on here soon. There's the Sagamore Lodge at Chickasaw in West Tennessee. Montgomery Bell in Middle Tennessee in Dixon County has some buildings at a group camp that are from the CCC. Actually, Montgomery Bell, I've been trying to convince them to move it. They have actually a barracks building that they reconverted into some kind of like record storage place in their maintenance area. It's a CCC building. I've been trying to get them to move it, but there are some CCC buildings out there. And then of course there's the Cedar Forest Lodge, which was in the present. Trying to think of any other ones. I'm sure that I'll leave one out and friends will find out about it and track me down. But the Cumberland Mountain has some cabins, and then the Birds Creek Dam is very striking when you can still drive across that. So yeah.
So someone asked about virtual field trips.
So we're still largely a brick and mortar operation. There are virtual field trips, but not about the New Deal yet. The only parks that are doing virtual field trips right now is Fort Loudon State Historic Area, and those are in the French and Indian War. We're dipping our toes into some virtual programming, but most of that's been in producing video content thus far. So we're hoping to do more virtual. There's been a big push from our leadership to do that here over the next little while too. And then the $30 million devoted to maintenance. There will be big construction projects coming down the pike. As far as maintenance, most of our historic structures are the CCC stuff is in pretty good shape because it's used a lot for weddings, and people still like to stay in them. It's funny, the cabins at Pickett, the stone cabins, which I've heard are not super comfortable in the winter, are still one of the most like used and utilized cabins that are out there because people love to stay in them and have, kind of have the experience of staying in them. So most of the CCC stuff is in pretty good shape. There are some we have a very large mill at Rock Island that I'm hoping receives some of that, but I know that some of that has also been slated for, we have a couple parks that need a visitor center. So I'm sure that'll take a chunk of that too.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for the questions. So if you have any more, just feel free to put those into the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of start moving us towards wrap up here, so you can be mindful of everyone's time. Move this box out of the way. Just a reminder again that you can find some of the resources referenced from today's session as well as our past on the Padlet. We dropped that link in the chat box as well earlier. Also, we have one more webinar in this series coming up next month, and that is going to be our teaching and primary sources staff. And we're going to be talking about the Trail of Tears through Tennessee. And we're going to be joined by Amy Costine, who is the Trail of Tears historian with the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation. So if you're interested in joining us for that one, you can just fill out the same form that you did in order to register for today, which is here at this link, this Google Forms link. And then if you would, please be sure to complete the short survey for today's session. It just helps us as we think about programming in the future with the Discover Tennessee History program. And again, we really do want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. The recording for this will be available, so you can go back and reference it for your own use or share it with your colleagues. And again, that'll be posted on the Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU YouTube channel, and that'll be up beginning tomorrow. We'll drop that survey link in the chat box, so it's a little easier for you to get to. You don't have to type it out. But I do want to go ahead and wrap us up. And again, thank you guys so much for joining us today. And we hope that you will join us next month for the last in the Discover Tennessee History webinar series.